All right. Well, it's good to be with you. It's good to meet you all virtually. And we're excited about dealing with these issues. At the same time, for those who know me, my family and friends, and people who are used to, hearing me speak, they realize that I always like to start with a joke, but COVID's just not very funny. And so it's been a real dilemma for me. And then, I was doing some research and I realized that even if I did tell a COVID joke, that 99.96% of people wouldn't get it. So anyway, and it's hard to tell a joke remotely because you can't get the audience feedback. But anyway, we are dealing with an exceptionally unprecedented, nightmarish catastrophe of epic proportions. And unfortunately, it doesn't even seem like there's any realistic end in sight. And so we're left with an enormous amount of uncertainty. And as we reflect over the last 6 months or so, let's just go through and enumerate the losses that we're grieving, that all of the changes, the freedoms that we have lost, the rights that have literally evaporated. These are unprecedented in our lifetime. The enormous amount of pain and suffering that has happened, not just from the horrible scourge of the disease, but all of the attendant losses that have rippled out from there. So as we begin to kind of inventory those losses, let's take a look at some of the kind of changes that 6 months ago were not a reality. I mean, take a look at all of the terminology, for example, that has filtered into basically our cultural nomenclature. We didn't use the word pandemic much, right? That was a very rare kind of thing. It's now very commonplace. What about the concept of social distancing? I'll come back to that one. But that is obviously an important factor. Masks, 6-foot rules. How about economic shutdown? How about lockdown? I mean, think about the ways in which life has changed. And then all of the suffering and loss, the people that have died. And I know there's tons of controversy. So now all this socio-political unrest that seems to have stemmed from the whole reality of our culture being turned upside down, literally. Never in the history of the world have we quarantined healthy people. It has never been done. It just doesn't make sense for epidemiologists to think about the way to boost our immune system is to isolate, when obviously the obverse of that is correct. So this is a huge issue, and I'm sorry for the technical issues here, but sorry about that. But anyway, these are enormous challenges that we're facing both individually and collectively. So when we look at all of these losses, we go back to even in the springtime. I remember the reality of my basketball team, as Steve mentioned, was rated #1, and they were preseason #1, and Bill Self had them peaking well. And I was speaking at a large men's conference the day before the NCAA tournament was canceled. And I said, men, I have a new disease. It hasn't existed for very long, but it's called March sadness, because I was really bummed that my team wouldn't have a chance to hang a 5th national championship banner in Allen Fieldhouse. But moreover, look at all of the losses that have happened. Kids didn't get to play spring sports to hopefully earn a college scholarship. They didn't get to graduate. They didn't have prom in high school. And then from out there, I mean, we basically lost a year of education for most elementary and middle school kids that aren't as computer savvy as need be to deal with online learning challenges, including of video and virtual kinds of opportunities to learn. But even more sadly to me, People who died had to be done, they had to do that in quarantine. That's never happened. And so the tragedies and the losses and the griefs are enormous. Add to that the incredible economic impact of basically the nation shutting down, the billions of dollars of lost gross national product, and then the individual mom and pop shops that have had to shut down. And again, interestingly and paradoxically, you can go to a big box store where there are hundreds of people, but a mom and pop store or shop or restaurant where there's a handful of people, that doesn't make sense to me, but nonetheless, that's happened. It's estimated that over half of mom and shop businesses that have shut down will never reopen. And that's tragic. And the losses there are enormous. When we take away a person's right to work, freedom to work, about which both David and King Solomon said is a gift from God, we lose a sense of vitality. We lose a sense of identity, a sense of purpose and meaning to care for ourselves and provide for our families. So there have been inordinate losses. Consequently, here's what we've seen in the mental health field as attendant to this pandemic and the crisis that we've had, again, that's unprecedented. The suicide rate has exponentially escalated. It is gripping people's hearts and lives in tragic ways like nothing else ever has. Suicides are at an all-time high. Divorce rates are as well. People have had to shelter in, and there are either going to be a slew of babies, that have happened as a result of COVID, but more tragically, a slew of divorces. We have seen domestic violence numbers at an all-time high, child abuse rates at an all-time high, alcoholism off the charts, all-time high. And of course, hard drug and opioid addictions and overdoses as well are escalating. Depression and anxiety levels are at an all-time high. So what can we do? How do we cope? What is it that we turn to when we're feeling what? Helpless. If there's any thread woven throughout all of these experiences we're coping with and trying to manage, it's a sense of abject helplessness. There is a sense in which we realize that we are creatures and we are dependent and we're powerless. So what are the things that we do? I want to give us 5 tools today that I believe can help us cope with this crisis as well as any other kind of catastrophe that we're dealing with. And because I love alliteration, and I know you're supposed to absolutely and always avoid alliteration, but I like it. It's fun, and I think it does help facilitate learning and memory. So these 5 tools or skill sets that I want to discuss today all begin with the letter S, and so I want to go through these one by one. The first tool that I want us to consider in dealing with our response to COVID as the crisis that's gripping us individually and collectively is our spirituality. It's interesting, in Mandarin, ironic, huh? The word crisis is very unique. In that language, there is not alphabet with letters, they use word pictures. But in Mandarin, there's not a discrete word picture for the term crisis. So what they do is they combine or blend 2 word pictures. One, the word for danger, we get that, but then the word for opportunity, and they weld those together. And so in a crisis, we definitely see the danger because it hits us right in the face, right? But what perhaps is more subtle, what is more difficult, is to look for the opportunity. And that is what I want us to consider today. It's kind of a reframe, but I want us to think about the opportunity that literally this may drive us to our knees, as it were, and how it is that we can build upon our spiritual resources. To begin with, we must realize that our faith does not depend on our circumstances. Now, our flesh, our human nature, makes it much easier to be good with God, to praise Him, to be joyous in our faith when things are going well, right? But I remember a pastor friend of mine years ago in a sermon series on maturity made a profound statement. And he observed correctly, I believe, that there are only two times to praise God. That's when we feel like it and when we don't, right? It's sort of like in a marriage covenant that's only valid on days that end in Y. So the point is this: God is worthy of our praise regardless of our circumstances. Now, that may feel artificial, that may feel contrived, that may even feel hypocritical when we're not feeling joyous, but our faith is not about our temporary sets of conditions. Our faith is about the fact that God does not change and he loves us no matter what. And so what I want us to take a look at are a couple of biblical examples. Job chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, we see that, and this great man of God went through a really brutal few minutes one afternoon. He's kicking back in a hammock, and servants are fanning him with palm leaves, and this other servant rushes up and tells him this horrible tragedy while he is still speaking. Another servant rushes up and tells him this terrible calamity while he is still speaking. Another servant rushes up and tells him about this horrible accident. And oh my goodness, it was devastating, overwhelming. His suffering was severe and intense. But note his response. He rips his clothes. He realizes the bookends of life are powerlessness, that I was born naked, I'm going to die naked. That's, to me, a metaphor for helplessness, dependency. We can't care for ourselves at either end of the continuum of life very effectively, obviously. We're dependent. And what he says is, we're now dependent. And he falls down to the ground and does something that seems absolutely counterintuitive. He worships. And what he realizes is God's worthy of worship no matter what our circumstances. And that, to me, is absolutely powerful. Then we see this minor prophet, Habakkuk. And by the way, I've often wondered, did minor prophets have struggles with feelings of inferiority? It's like, I'm never going to be a major prophet, like Daniel and Isaiah and Jeremiah. And by the way, nobody names their kids after minor prophets. Who names their kid Obadiah or Habakkuk or Zephaniah, right? I mean, Nahum. We just don't do that. So I've wondered if these guys kind of struggle. Sorry, that's random and tangential, but I'll come back. And oh my goodness, let's see, my phone just died. But what Habakkuk 3:17 through 19 tells us is something that's incredibly profound. And what he says is this. I think I can get it from memory. He says, though the fig tree does not blossom, though the grapevine bears no fruit, though there are no crops in the field, though there are no sheep in the pen, though there are no cattle in the stalls. Okay, let's call time out. That's drastic. When you go back 3,600 years ago in an agrarian culture, when you have no fruit, no vegetables, no grains, no meat, no dairy, what does that mean? That means you're facing starvation, a brutal and horrible death. So what does Habakkuk conclude? He says, yet I will rejoice. Yeah, I will rejoice in the Lord, my Savior, because he enables me to go on the heights. He gives me the feet of a deer and enables me to go on the heights. And to me, that's a metaphor for getting out of the pit we're in and being transcendent. You know, deer have an incredible ability to leap and to jump and to run and climb. And so he's saying, God's going to enable me not to dwell in the depths of despair and the fear and frustration and futility of my suffering, but God's going to give me a transcendent capability. And then he says it again, I'm going to rejoice. Wow, that's powerful. So what is that about? Well, it's fascinating. Recent neuroscience research shows this. We have discovered it is impossible to worry and worship at the same time. The brain cannot do it. We can pat our head and rub our belly simultaneously, but we cannot worry and worship. And so obviously Habakkuk and Job had read that research, or they knew from God that this is a physiological, humanistic impossibility to both worry and to worship at the same time. That to me is profound. So our default mode as humans is to worry when we're under stress, when we're dealing with crisis, and we're dealing with catastrophe. And here are two powerful biblical examples of dealing with a crisis and a catastrophe dynamic and situation where instantly both men worshiped instead of worrying. I recommend that highly. A more contemporary example of how to cope in drawing from our spiritual resources when we're in the midst of a crisis is Viktor Frankl. Dr. Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist when in World War II, the Jews were being obviously tortured and murdered en masse by the Nazis. And he himself, being a Jew, when the Nazis found out that he was sent to a concentration camp and tortured more viciously than anyone else in his barracks, such that he was the only survivor, ironically. It was like, how does that work? He got the worst treatment, but yet was the only survivor. Then he was sent to another barracks and was the only survivor from that one. Then, frustrated, the Nazis put him in Auschwitz, and he was about to die when the war ended, but he was rescued by the Allied forces. He wrote a book about his experience called Man's Search for Meaning, which some literary folks rate as one of the top 10 most influential books in history. It's a wonderful book. It's not a good book in terms of a warm fuzzy. It's not light bedtime reading. It's brutal. The atrocities and the torturings that he experienced were unspeakably horrible. But the way he said he survived was very simple, actually. It has to do with this same neurological dynamic that Job and Habakkuk utilized, and it was this. He drew from his faith, and what he determined, he said was, the Nazis can control everything about my circumstances but one thing. They cannot control how I choose to respond to the atrocities that they're perpetuating and perpetrating onto me. And that caused him to survive and yet even thrive. And that to me is powerful. So our spiritual resources can literally help us survive impossible kinds of circumstances. Okay. Now my computer's freezing up, but I'm not sure why it's not advancing. Never had that happen before. Well, wow, this is challenging. Okay, but we will go on. The second thing that I want us to draw from, in addition to our spiritual resources, has to do with self-care. When we're tempted to sit on the couch and binge watch or surf and put stuff in our bodies that is really junk food, it's probably not going to be good for us. So what I want to propose is a three-legged stool, as it were, of self-care that is quite simple, actually, and ironically parallels the three aspects of God, the Father, Son, and Spirit, respectively. So let's take a look at the first, the Holy Spirit. The Bible teaches us that physically our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So under self-care, the first point is we have to take care of ourselves physically. And again, as the temple of the Holy Spirit. How do we do that? Again, quite simple: diet, rest, exercise. It has been said that movement is medicine, and getting outside, building up our immune system, even eating more dirt, obviously is going to help us immunologically. Movement is medicine. And obviously, I'm not going to yell at you about diet, or rest, because I know those are two tough things for grad students, but we need those. We need to get proper sleep, we need to eat well, and obviously exercise. The second aspect of self-care is, how do we deal with ourselves mentally? How do we have, as it were, the mind of Christ, right? Well, that's something the Apostle Paul commands us to do, is to develop a godly mindset where we have a Christological worldview and value system. And when we have that kind of mental framework, it really helps us. And so what are some practical, tangible aspects of how we develop the mind of Christ? I believe there are three simple ones. First is turning off media and electronics. As a culture, we were glued to the television as we watched those numbers rise. as we were told we were going to, flatten the curve, right? I think we're in like day 200 and something of the 2-week flattening of the curve. But nonetheless, what we know is that all of the media stuff isn't helping us emotionally or mentally. And so turning that off is going to be very important. I'm not suggesting we stay in denial. I'm saying saturating in an addictive way, filling our brains with fear and hysteria that the mass media hyped up that was absolutely sending people over the edge is not a good thing. We have to, as with most things, have a healthy balance, okay? So being saturated with hype and hysteria is not going to help us mentally. Secondly, we need to practice Philippians 4:8. What is Philippians 4:8? It says, think about the good stuff. If anything is lovely or just or praiseworthy or excellent or noble or of good report, think about those things. And that is profoundly important to do. Then thirdly, we need to take every thought captive. Paul commands us to do that. How do you take a thought captive? We know how to take a prisoner captive. It's by force, it's by intentionality, it's by effort and design. You have to have a plan, you have to have a means. So taking thoughts captive is a really important principle of many kinds of psychotherapy systems, particularly cognitive behavioral theory. We realize how we can literally control our thoughts and our minds. And so I would refer you to that to think more deeply about that dynamic. And then thirdly, in addition to physically and mentally, we need to care for ourselves emotionally. And I think the most important thing there to understand is to know that the Heavenly Father loves you, okay? That has the most emotionally significant implications of anything else in our universe. The Father loves you, and that's going to help you emotionally. In addition to that broad or generalized concept, there are 3 additional suggestions I want to make about how to care for yourself emotionally. The first is to acknowledge and validate your feelings. That is essential. Your feelings are neither good nor bad. They simply are. What we do with them is the issue as to whether or not they're healthful or destructive. The second thing we need to do is process our feelings. We need to vent. We need to find some non-destructive outlets when fear has us by the throats, or we're furious, or we're bummed out beyond description. We have to find some ways to process and then non-destructively vent those emotions. Talking them out instead of acting them out is most important. And then thirdly, as a way to do that, find a safe, trusted confidant to talk with. This is a good plug for effective therapy, but peer counseling or a good friend can be very helpful and useful here too. Having somebody that we can share our heart with is essential. So we need to care for ourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally. In addition to our spiritual resources and self-care, the third thing that we need of the 5 general principles I want us to think about today is structure. When we're under stress, when we're under chaos, we need routine. And we have nothing routine as we've been in this national shutdown or lockdown. And by that, I mean we need regular meal times, bedtimes, et cetera, because those counteract a sense of boredom, a sense of fear and frustration, and they provide a natural rhythm to life. Just as we know sleep cycles and biorhythms and circadian rhythms are important to sleep and dealing with sleep improvement, so too, they structure our lives in other ways too. We need a natural rhythm. That's why going to work is an important thing for us structurally. When you think about how boot camps and treatment facilities and psychiatric centers operate, they do so on a basis of structure. You don't have to think about anything. You just do what you're told. And when we're over an enormous amount of stress, when we're dealing with incredible difficulty, we need structure to provide us with, again, 3 things: stability, sameness, and security. So structure will always provide and afford those very important psychological and sociological structures that give us a sense of power and strength. If you think about the body physiologically, without bones, without that structure, it's obviously not going to be very strong and resilient. And so too, we need structures in our lives that may be implicit or embedded or invisible, but nonetheless provide us with stability and sameness and security. And with most folks working from home, if at all, there's very little things to structure their lives in ways that are meaningful and helpful and productive. So again, to briefly review, we need our spiritual resources, we need self-care, we need structures. The fourth thing we need is socialization. We need people, especially since we're alienating and isolating from other people. Now, I said at the outset that I would come back to the social distancing term. I hate that term. And a client very wisely pointed out to me a much better term would be physical distancing. And I've seen some in the society start to use that. So let's not distance ourselves socially. We need to physically, so that droplets of viral particles aren't transmitted unintentionally. So physical distancing helps us with our immunological system, but it harms us interpersonally, okay? Genesis 2:18 says famously, it's not good for people to be alone, and it's not. When we're seeing this incredibly massive cultural-wide isolation and insulation of other people, it's harmful, it's destructive, it hurts us because we need other people. And so the second thing I want us to think about in terms of our socialization challenge is what fear does. And again, we have a broad hysteric fear in the culture. I'll never forget the first time we were able to go out, because our governor in Virginia is very stringent. And so I went to Lowe's one day because I needed some things for our home. And the parking lot was fuller than it was on Black Friday. I mean, that store was completely packed. So I'm going down one aisle and I wasn't wearing a mask. This was, again, early on. And I saw a gentleman, probably in his early 40s, leaning down, kind of kneeling down on the floor, looking at the bottom shelf. And we were the only two people in the aisle. And our eyes met as I was walking down the aisle, and fear just gripped him enormously. He was terrified, and his eyes were bulging, and I like, oh my goodness, he thinks I'm going to contaminate him. So I very quickly walked by him as fast as I could, turned my head as far away from him as I could, and took a deep breath and made sure he saw me do that so I wouldn't be breathing out on him. And I went past him real quickly. But it struck me how terrified he was instantly, that he was going to catch this from me and would die. It was gripping. And that's what fear does. Fear isn't rational necessarily. It causes us, though, to instinctively activate our amygdala, and, part of the brain that causes us to have, fight or flight or freezing, as it were, all of which are activated by fear. And so we have to overcome that. Now, let's think smart. How do we maintain our healthy relationships while we physically distance? And so we have to be creative. We need to virtually connect. It may be good to reach out to people who are lonely and needy, like a different paradigm for particularly older folks. And I really grieve for folks in care facilities or nursing facilities because they're desperately lonely. But you know what really would help them? Phone calls or letters that we handwrite. Many of them are not technologically oriented. And so, emails or virtual connections may not be possible, but reach out to people that you love and are connected to. That will help them. It will also bless you. And then thirdly, we have to be intentional to nurture our closest relationships. I realized that I had neglected some friends that, since we couldn't go to church for 6 months here in Virginia, I was really missing a lot of friends and I had not connected with them. So I reached out. I did some calling and texting and emailing to reach out to friends in a way that it was like this is good. We need to connect and do stuff. So met up with some people, and that kind of connecting is important. We need other people. So the fifth thing, in addition to our spiritual resources, our self-care, our structure, and our socialization, is when we're in a crisis, we need strengthening. A crisis naturally will deplete us. It will weaken us. It will take from us coping resources. So we need to be strong. And so I think there are three ways, again, we can go about that. The first is to develop resilience. There's an old sermon illustration about two frogs that I think powerfully illustrate this point of resilience. So two frogs in a barn fell into two buckets of cream that the farmer had left there after milking the cows. So the first frog falls into the bucket of water and panics, and he just goes, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible, I'm gonna drown," and he croaks. Get it? Frog, croak. So he's dead. The second frog falls into another identical bucket of cream and then decides, you know what? I'm going to swim as hard as I can for as long as I can. I'm going to do my best to survive. And so he doesn't panic, and he swims and swims and swims. And after a while, that cream gets churned into butter, after which the frog jumps onto the butter and hops out of the bucket. That story to me powerfully illustrates our approach to dealing with a crisis. We can either, become better or bitter. We can either become a victim or a victor. And I think that illustrates resilience so well. Are we going to let this make us better or bitter? And that's our decision. That's our choice. Do we work at it? Are we going to become a victim, or will we become victorious, to be transcendent and rise above the circumstances that we may be completely powerless about, in which we find ourselves? But if we keep swimming, that cream gets churned into butter. That's important. Secondly, I think in addition to resilience, it's very, very important for us to develop courage. Courage is something that gives us enormous strength and power. I like the etymology of the word encourage. It means to put courage into us, right? And the best example I know of in literature anywhere is in Joshua chapter 1, verses 5-9. And we don't have time to really unpack that, unfortunately, because it's profoundly illustrative of the best example of courage, perhaps in human history. Because just real briefly to set the setting, of the 12 spies that were sent into the promised land by Moses to scout out the territory and kind of take a look at, okay, how can we go about doing this? 10 out of 12 spies surveyed said, it can't be done. There's giants in them thar hills. We can't do it. But Joshua and Caleb, of the 12 spies, were two that said, well, actually, we can do it. It's an amazing place. It's a land flowing, as it were, with milk and honey. And so they brought back enormous amounts of fruit to illustrate to the people that, hey, we can do this. But we're going to have to be intentional, and we're going to have a plan and a design. And so Joshua was commissioned by Moses to do that. And God is preparing him in verses 5-9 that says, do not be afraid. Be strong and very courageous, for I am with you. Now, it's interesting, that term, do not be afraid. My wife and I, as was said in the introduction, have 4 sons, and I was teaching them about the fact, when most of them were teenagers, the youngest one wasn't yet, but about how to deal with fear, and the irony that some wise person pointed out that the Bible tells us 365 times not to be afraid. Isn't that an interesting number? What a coincidence, huh? So I was pointing out to our sons, I said, what about that, guys? There's one promise every single day where God tells us to not be afraid. And one of our sons, our oldest, says, okay, Dad, so what you're telling us is that on February 29th, every 4 years, we're on our own, right? Tough crowd. Who invited him, really? I was thinking, that's my boy right there. So Yeah. Okay, son, you're missing the point. God is telling us every day, except for in leap year. Okay, all right, you got me. If you want to be literalistic, you're missing the point, dude. But nonetheless, God encourages us to not be afraid. And I love that. He accepts and understands our humanity and our humanness to where we are naturally afraid in a crisis. But what he is saying is, be strong and courageous instead of being afraid. Why? What's the operative transitional point? For I am with you. Okay? He provides Joshua this assurance that even though there's giants, and there were the predecessors of Goliath and his four brothers that were all 9 feet to 9 feet 6. Those are big guys. But what God is telling Joshua is this: I'm with you. Okay? And that courage is what strengthens us. That says, okay, I can face difficult circumstances because God is with us. And that courage comes through. And then the third thing I want us to consider in conclusion is to develop Christ-like character. Because character is what matters. Not our characteristics, but our character. And I wish people would remember the concept that with all of the race stuff that's going on in our world, and the looting and rioting and burning and destruction, that Martin Luther King himself said that we need to focus on our character, not our characteristics. And that is so true in every circumstance, in all situations. That's true. And of course, he then said, whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Why? Because faith cancels fear. Just as the brain cannot worry and worship at the same time, we cannot exercise faith and be fearful at the same time. And so that's what we need. And those are the things that I think will help us cope. Coping with a crisis and with a catastrophe is very challenging and may seem humanly impossible. But I think when we realize our spiritual resources, our self-care principles, our sense of structures, our socialization, and ways to strengthen ourselves, I think we can get through it successfully. So God bless you all. And I guess now we're going to transition for questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Sorry, Jordan. Yeah, I was going to say, Jordan's going to take over for the question section.
Okay, perfect. So Dr. Pingleton, so we had a question. Can or how can a person without a belief in God or any gods cope spiritually?
That's a great question. I think less well, shortly, seriously. But the imago Dei is something in which all humans are created from a Christian biblical worldview, obviously. We're created in the image and likeness of God. And so wise people throughout history have noted that there's a God-shaped vacuum in us all. And so I think for folks who do have faith that encounter folks who don't, it's a great opportunity to introduce them to one's faith and to share, to say, hey, here's what works for me. Here's what helps. So to me, that's an opportunity for sharing one's faith and for evangelization.
Awesome, thank you. So another question was, how can we have a good structure in grad school if we have a family where things can change daily and it may be hard to plan for surprises?
It is hard to plan for surprises. And so let me go to physiology as a way to illustrate a response to your question. It's a great question. Graduate school is brutal, okay? I had 6 years in my program, in my PsyD, and it's hard on a good day, and these aren't good days. So as Jordan, you were asking the question, I was thinking of the difference between, an exoskeleton and an isoskeleton. When we have internalized structures, obviously that works well. But if those are gone or removed circumstantially, then we have to provide external structures, okay? So if you think about a broken limb, right? When it's broken and the isostructure is not there, we have to use an exostructure. It's called a cast. And so I think analogously, that's what makes sense to me, is when our internal structures are eviscerated or evaporated, we have to provide some external ones. So we have to be intentional, maybe picking somebody else's brain to say, hey, this stuff is changing. I don't know what to do. I've got all these assignments, all these stressors. We've got kids that are staying at home, and spouses that can't work outside the home. They have to work from home. The kids are screaming everywhere. Everybody's having to be a homeschool parent. How do we get a new normal, right? We have to be very intentional and carve out those times and spaces to do that. And so I think here's where having maybe an online forum of ideas, exchanging suggestions, like a suggestion board, might be a really useful way to creatively share ideas, because we don't need to reinvent a wheel, and particularly if it had a flat tire. We need to help each other through this. So I think sharing ideas to me is a great way to do that.
Thank you. Okay, we just have a couple more. Somebody asked, it's not so related, but is there a translation of the Bible that you prefer? And if so, why?
Sure. Yeah, there are lots of good translations that just in the last few years, we have learned so much more about biblical languages from the ongoing excavation of more scrolls from the Qumran cave area, especially of Israel. I had the privilege to be there about a year and a half ago, and mountain climbed up into some of those caves. It was really fun. It was really cool. So we're learning a lot more about languages. Thus, we're able to, I think, do a more effective job of translating into English terminology, things like nuance of meaning and so on, into different languages. So for me, I like many of the modern translations. I think for me personally, the one I use, bottom line, is the New International Version of the Bible, that to me takes a look at a multi-denominational set of scholars had input into parsing difficult texts, or looking at nuances of language and meaning. And so from lots and lots of different, my irreverent term for denomination is brand. So they're all humanly created. So my irreverent term, their brand, people from lots of different brands kind of agree. And so to me, it's a great way to take a look at, breaking down the original language. I'm not a Greek or Hebrew or Aramaic scholar. I'm glad about that, actually, but I respect those who are, and the best ones apparently, and the best brains in the world were in a project to cooperate with that particular translation. So that's what I like.
Awesome, thank you. Another question was, how can I cope with my anger at my roommates/neighbors who are not following state and local COVID guidelines?
Yeah, punching them in the mouth is not a good plan. That's a temptation, not a sin. I'm not recommending. I just said, is that not a good plan? I think we need to give them a very clear message to say, listen, here's my concern, and you, I feel disrespected when you completely ignore my preferences, and I'm stating this strongly because I'm very concerned. And so I think that to me is probably the best way to cope, is to give them a direct message. If that doesn't work, then I think we need to set some clear and firm boundaries. We may need them to tell them that they need to move or whatever. So I think it's important to kind of de-escalate the emotional intensity, but help them understand, listen, here's my conviction. If you're not concerned, okay, I can respect that. But if I am, I would like you to respect my concern. And here's that's such a great question, Jordan, because so many people have such intense differences on this issue. Some people completely dismiss it. There are all these statistics that can be used to advocate for saying phooey on it, or, oh, we're all gonna die. And so I think we have people all across the board on that continuum. And so the question is a good one. I think in essence, we need to communicate our feelings using I language, and we need to set firm and clear boundaries.
Thank you.
And a punching bag is good for the residual anger, to where we don't hurt ourselves, don't hurt anybody, don't hurt them, just to get our anger out in a non-destructive way.
Okay,
mattresses and pillows work too, so yeah.
Another question would be, do you have any tips on balancing socializing digitally and not over consuming the fear-inducing media?
Good question. Socializing by virtual means is direct interaction with humans that are responsive and mutually interacting. Social media, I'm not a fan because it's like texting. If I had a nickel for every marriage dispute I've dealt with in psychotherapy over the years from texting, I could have retired a couple of years ago. It's a terrible way to communicate. We miss tone of voice, inflections, we miss nonverbals, right? And so to me, social media is the worst form of communication other than smoke signal or carrier pigeon that's ever been devised by humanity. So one of our sons is really on social media a lot, and I try to loosely just kind of look at that, and it's like, okay, son, I'm gonna ask you a question. How many people's opinions have you changed by your passionate on social media about various issues? And secondly, people's minds typically, nor are they going to change ours. So yeah, so social media, not a fan. It's not going to help us.
Okay, thank you. So the last question that we have is, I'm so sorry. You discussed resilience. How would you go about developing that?
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't build that out well, other than the frog story implicitly. And what the frog that survived and didn't croak did was they swam and swam and swam. They didn't give up. So I think it's literally like, how do you build strong muscles? Repetitive working. And you're going to get sore. You're going to get tired. You don't build up muscle tissue without breaking down existing muscle tissue, right? We know that from trainers and these sadists called physical therapists. Sorry, that's how you build resilience. Is you do a lot of repetition to the point of exhaustion, and so you work at it. Resilience doesn't happen by Tuesday, okay? It's something we have to make a commitment to be in a long haul kind of self-discipline and structure.
Awesome, thank you. That's all the questions we have. Steve?
All right, yeah, we just want to all thank you. I know that doing a digital seminar is kind of weird because we can't, like, oh, thank him for coming and everyone claps, I guess we could, but we would like to let you know, thank you so much for coming, and we really appreciated your presentation and your answers. And
good.
Yeah. And we hope to do
have
something.
A blessed day.
You as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you, everyone.